most important things is to not be so arrogant as to think that we develop developing countries, because we don't. They develop themselves. And so when it comes to them, it's not what we can impose on them. They have got to come up with their own governance. You know, of the 59 countries that are at the bottom of the NDG development table, 66% of them have had or are in a civil war. So, you know, when it comes to conflict, there are measures that they have to do in terms of sorting out their own internal problems. Governance, corruption, there are so many issues that they have to do. Yes, aid and yes, trade reform is part of our deal, you know, goal 8 of the MDGs, but a lot of it, the onus is on governments to do it for themselves.
Now, if you look when it comes to the topic of aid effectiveness, when did this come about? So in the 60s, the concern was with savings. In the 70s and 80s, the concern was, you know, the big bad structural adjustment programs. So policy reform in third world countries. In the 90s, aid effectiveness was the buzzword of the day and has remained until today. Why? Donor fatigue. Persistence of poverty. It has persisted despite all of this. So if you were to go sub-Saharan Africa, you're talking $450 billion over 40 years. And you know what? They are still where they were. Right? The situation has improved in certain instances, and it has deteriorated in others. And so we say we need aid to be effective. And we're right, aid does need to be effective. Right? We're pouring all this money, and we should see some improvements. And there have been some improvements. There's no doubt about that. But as I said, there has been deterioration in certain areas.
I think there's also another point. There's a difference between aid effectiveness, which tends to be a very bureaucratic agenda around meeting all sorts of processes and targets and so on, and development effectiveness. And development effectiveness is kind of doesn't make a difference. And typically the people who are concerned about aid effectiveness are, have you ticked the box about the forms being filled in correctly, rather than did this actually help you? And, you know, it has to be said that, you know, aid is not given in a neutral context, and very often what you have is very incoherent policies. So, you know, the reason that there's conflict in lots of countries around the world isn't only a problem of those countries, it's the problem often of interfering outsiders who want to grab hold of their natural resources. Or it's interfering outsiders who want to sell them guns. And, you know, over 90% of the guns in the world are sold by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So, you know, they're not very keen at the moment on the campaign to have an arms trade treaty which would limit the sale of small arms in ways that could exacerbate conflict. So, you know, and, you know, the whole issue of trade we could talk about for a long time, but, you know, it's very much, you know, you give with one hand and you take much more. It's not only debt repayments, there's a whole issue around the unfairness of the rules on trade, which actually means, for example, in New Zealand, we give aid to the Pacific, but, you know, the trade deficit that the Pacific has with New Zealand, we sell them $1 billion worth of exports. They export to us about 170 million. So there's a gap there, a trade deficit of 830 million with the Pacific. Now, we're not providing any sort of aid that would redress that balance at all. And in fact, you know, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get them to sign up to trade agreements which would boost exports from New Zealand even further. So, you know, there's some very, very incoherent policies. And often I think the issues of aid effectiveness have to be dealt with in a broader context of what relationships does New Zealand or do the developed countries have with other countries in terms of a coherent approach which would you know, benefit that country rather than in many ways giving with one hand and taking back much more with the other.
I think just to follow up and to pick up on the historical angle, I think we do need to realise there has been that shift, that geopolitical shift, where it becomes a lot more convenient for us to talk about numbers, measurement, and while I agree that we need to follow the buck, we need to know how much money has been given to UNICEF, for instance, compared to UNIFEM, which is a disastrous, huge gap. We need to follow the buck, but we need to come back to the basic principle, I think, that Barry was making about there's no such thing as aid effectiveness unless you can answer the question of what is development effectiveness.
think in terms of coherence, World Vision India were recently sharing with me that they had 23 different formats for government grants to fill. And I guess the question that always goes through our minds is, what's the definition of success and whose success is it? And I think really it's about success, is it community success? And we can have all the forms filled out, everything ticked off, but at the end of the day, whose development are we talking about, and whose success are we taking as success?